The moment the doors opened, every instinct in my body told me something was wrong. I am Vesithra Knoll, ruling queen of the Kale Dominion, and I have sat through 400 first meetings with lesser species. I know the shape of fear when it walks into a room wearing a diplomat's face. I know the smell of a species trying to hide how small they feel next to us. I have seen ambassadors shake, stutter, and freeze the instant my translation engines activate, because no outsider has ever heard our true voice and kept their composure. So when the human delegation entered the audience chamber on that neutral station, I expected the same trembling, the same darting eyes, the same desperate reliance on machines to survive the conversation. I did not expect calm. I did not expect a young man to walk forward, stop exactly at the second marked tile as if he had memorized our protocols down to the measurement, and look directly into my eyes without blinking. My high steward, Orcanth, leaned toward me and whispered that this was normal for new species, that confidence was often a mask for terror. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him, because the alternative was that this small, soft-skinned creature was not afraid of me at all. I opened the exchange the way I always do, in Kalisisa, our royal tongue. It is not spoken by outsiders. It cannot be spoken by outsiders. The subharmonics require a throat structure no other species in known space possesses. Every alien in this chamber has always waited, patient and silent, for the translation drones, hovering above their heads, to convert my words into something their minds could hold. I said, in my own language, "Welcome to the Kale Dominion, human. I hope your journey here was without incident." I said it slowly, deliberately, testing the translation delay, testing the drones, testing nothing at all really, because I already knew what would happen next. The drones would hum. The human would wait. The words would arrive a heartbeat later in his own tongue, and he would answer in it. That is not what happened. The human answered me immediately, before the drones had even begun their work, and he answered in Kalisisa. The sound that came from his throat was wrong in the way that surprises are wrong, not in the way that mistakes are wrong. His accent was imperfect, yes. The subharmonic beneath his words was thinner than mine, less resonant, missing the deep undertone that comes from a second vocal chamber he does not have. But the words themselves, the grammar, the formal address, the honorific he attached to my name, all of it was correct. He said, "Thank you, Queen Vesithra Knoll. The journey was long, but I have looked forward to standing here for a very long time." For a moment, I could not respond. My steward's breath caught beside me. Somewhere behind the human delegation, I heard one of my court scribes drop a data tablet, and the small clatter it made against the floor felt impossibly loud in the silence that followed. I have ruled for 30 cycles. I have negotiated treaties with species who could crack a planet in half. I have stared down warlords without flinching. But in that moment, sitting on my own throne, in my own chamber, surrounded by my own guards, I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. I felt unprepared. I studied him more closely then. He was not unusually tall for his species, from what little I knew of humans at the time. His hair was dark, cut short in the practical way soldiers and officials often wear it. His eyes were a shade of brown that seemed almost too warm for the coldness of diplomatic protocol. He wore a simple dark uniform with no excessive decoration, nothing like the layered ceremonial robes my own court insists upon. If I had passed him on a station corridor without context, I would have assumed he was unimportant. He was not unimportant. No creature capable of speaking my sacred tongue without preparation could ever be unimportant again. I asked him, still in Kalisasa, how he had learned to speak this way. I kept my voice level, but I made sure every syllable carried the weight of a demand, not a question. Queens do not ask, queens require. He paused before answering, and in that pause I saw something almost apologetic cross his face, an expression so distinctly human that even without cultural context I understood it. It was the look of someone about to say something that might be taken the wrong way, and choosing to say it honestly anyway. He told me that human linguists had studied recordings taken from Kale scout vessels years earlier, sound leaked from routine communications never meant to be heard by outside ears. He said his people had spent years reconstructing the phonetic patterns, mapping the subharmonics as closely as human throats could manage, building models and training speakers long before any formal contact was ever expected. He said his name was Daniel Hart, and that he had been one of 17 people selected for this mission, specifically because he had trained the longest. I did not know whether to feel violated or fascinated. Perhaps I felt both. My steward certainly felt only the first of those things. I could hear him breathing faster beside me, the particular rhythm he takes on when he is calculating political damage in his head. Around the chamber, murmurs rippled through my court, like wind moving through dry grass. Some of my nobles looked offended, as though something sacred had been stolen from them. Others looked afraid, the kind of fear that comes not from threat but from confusion, from watching the natural order of things bend in a direction they had never imagined. I felt something different from either of those. I felt curiosity, sharp and sudden, the kind I had not experienced since I was very young and still believed the universe held surprises worth chasing. I asked him whether he understood the significance of what he had just done, whether his people understood that Kalissa was reserved for royal ears, that even most of my own citizens are not permitted to learn its formal structure, that outsiders who attempt to imitate it are usually mocked for their failure rather than praised for their effort. He answered that he understood it mattered greatly, and that this was precisely why his team had worked so hard to get it right. He said humans do not like to enter a room assuming they will be underestimated, and that if there was any chance, language could become a barrier between our peoples. His government wanted to remove that barrier before it could ever be raised against them. There was no arrogance in the way he said it. That surprised me almost as much as the words themselves. I had expected pride, perhaps even a hint of triumph at having accomplished something no other species had managed. Instead, his tone carried something closer to quiet determination, the sound of someone who had simply refused to accept failure as an option and had not yet decided whether success was something to celebrate or merely something to be relieved by. I sat in silence for a long moment, longer than protocol allows, long enough that I felt Orcanth shift uncomfortably beside me, waiting for me to reclaim control of the room. I did reclaim it, eventually. I told the assembly that the audience would continue, and that formal negotiations regarding trade and territory would begin the following cycle as scheduled. I kept my voice steady. I kept my expression composed. Queens are trained from birth to never let a room see uncertainty on their face, and whatever I felt in that moment, I did not allow it to reach my expression. But inside, my mind was already racing far ahead of the formal proceedings. I have negotiated with 100 species who feared us because they did not understand us. Fear built from ignorance is easy to manage. It is predictable. It bends the way you expect it to bend. But a species that studies you before you have even properly noticed them, a species willing to spend years learning a language they were never meant to speak, simply so that no advantage could be taken against them in a single conversation, that is not a species built from the same fear I am used to managing. That is a species built from something else entirely. As the human delegation was led from the chamber to their assigned quarters, I watched Daniel Hart walk past my throne. He inclined his head toward me in a gesture that was neither fully human nor fully Kale, some deliberate blend of both cultures' respect, as if he had studied that too, as if nothing about his presence in my court had been left to chance. He did not look afraid. He did not look proud either. He simply looked like someone who had done exactly what he came to do, and was already thinking about what came next. I turned to Orcanth once the chamber doors had closed behind the humans. My steward's face had gone pale in the particular way that meant he was already imagining the political consequences that would ripple through every corner of my court by morning. He asked me what I intended to do. I told him I intended to find out exactly how much this small, quiet species had learned about us, and exactly how far they were willing to go to make certain they were never underestimated again. I did not yet know that the answer to that question would change the future of my entire empire. But I suspected it, even then, sitting alone on my throne, long after the chamber had emptied, replaying the sound of my own sacred language spoken correctly by a voice that should never have been able to speak it at all. For the first time in 30 cycles of rule, I found myself looking forward to a second meeting with something other than duty. I found myself looking forward to it with something closer to fear. And something closer to hope. I did not sleep that night. Queens are permitted many privileges, but true rest is rarely one of them, and on that particular night I would not have accepted rest even if it had been offered. I sat in my private chamber with the recording of the audience playing again and again, listening to Daniel Hart's voice shape the sounds of my language, searching for the flaw that would prove it had all been some elaborate trick. I found no flaw. I found only imperfection, which is not the same thing at all. His tone dipped slightly wrong on the second syllable of my formal title. His subharmonic faded half a breath too early at the end of longer sentences, a limitation of human anatomy rather than a failure of effort. But the grammar was correct. The structure was correct. The respect embedded into the phrasing, the layered honorifics that even some of my own nobles struggle to use properly, all of it was correct. A trick does not bother with details that only a native speaker would notice. A trick performs for an audience that cannot tell the difference. Daniel Hart had not performed for an audience. He had performed for me specifically, assuming I would notice everything, and preparing for that possibility, regardless of the cost. By morning, I had made a decision that would have horrified my steward if I had announced it publicly. I summoned Daniel Hart to a private audience, away from both our delegations, away from cameras and scribes and the political machinery that turns every royal action into a symbol before it can simply be an action. Orcanth argued against it for the better part of an hour. He reminded me that queens do not meet unknown envoys alone. He reminded me that this was precisely how vulnerabilities were created, how thrones were destabilized, how enemies found their opening. He was not wrong to worry. It was his duty to worry, and he performed that duty well. But I have ruled long enough to trust my own instincts over inherited caution, and my instincts told me that whatever Daniel Hart was, he was not a threat in the way Orcanth feared. The private chamber I chose was smaller than the grand hall, warmer in lighting, meant for conversations rather than performances. I had 2 guards stationed outside the door, a concession to my steward's nerves, but none inside the room itself. I wanted this conversation unwitnessed. I wanted to see what a human looked like when there was no audience left to perform for. He arrived precisely on time, neither early in a way that might seem eager, nor late in a way that might seem disrespectful. He wore the same simple uniform as the day before, and he bowed his head slightly upon entering, the same careful blend of human and Kale gesture I had noticed earlier. I told him to sit, and I studied his face as he did. I began once again in Scalisa. I asked him to recite something for me, not a formal greeting this time, but something older, something harder. I gave him the opening lines of the morning chant, a piece of ceremonial poetry reserved for royal funerals, passed down through generations of my bloodline, taught only to those born into the Knoll family or trained for decades in the deepest halls of our temple scholars. I expected him to fail. I wanted him to fail, if I am honest with myself now. Some part of me needed proof that there were limits to what this species could accomplish, a boundary I could point to and say, here, this is where they stop being remarkable and become merely competent. He did not fail. His accent faltered more noticeably on the archaic vocabulary, words no longer used in common Kale speech, words that exist now only within ceremony and memory. But he pushed through each line with visible effort, and when he reached the final verse, the one that speaks of grief, carried forward not as a wound, but as a gift passed between generations, his voice softened in a way that had nothing to do with pronunciation and everything to do with understanding. He was not simply repeating sounds he had memorized. He understood what the words meant. He understood the weight they were meant to carry. I asked him how a human, A species who had known of my empire's existence for what could only have been a handful of years, had managed to access ceremonial texts that even some neighboring Kale provinces do not have permission to study. He told me the truth plainly, without hesitation, which I would come to learn was simply how he communicated in most situations. He said that certain elements of the morning chant had been referenced publicly in historical archives available to any species with access to interstellar trade records, fragments quoted in diplomatic histories written by species who had encountered my empire generations before humanity ever left their own solar system. He said human researchers had gathered every fragment they could find, cross-referenced them against language patterns reconstructed from the scout vessel recordings, and pieced together an approximation. An approximation, he called it, as though what he had just performed for me was somehow incomplete rather than extraordinary. I asked him why. Not how this time, but why. Why would an entire species dedicate years of resources and countless hours of specialized labor toward learning to speak the private ceremonial language of an empire they had not yet even formally met? His answer stayed with me long after that meeting ended, and it stays with me still. He said that humans have a long history of being underestimated by those who consider themselves stronger, older, or more advanced. He said this had happened many times throughout human history, between different nations and peoples on their own world, long before humanity ever looked outward to the stars. He said that pattern, being dismissed first and respected only after proving oneself through struggle, had shaped something deep within human culture, a kind of stubborn refusal to walk into any room assuming they would be treated as lesser. He said that when humanity first detected signs of the Kale Dominion, when they realized an empire vastly larger and more advanced than their own civilization existed within reach of their sensors, the first instinct among many of his people was fear. But the second instinct, the one that mattered more in the long run, was determination. If they were going to be judged, they wanted to be judged fairly, on their own merits, not simply dismissed as primitive before they had ever spoken a single word. Learning my language was never meant as a display of superiority, he explained. It was meant as a statement of respect, and perhaps more honestly, as an act of self-protection. A species that controls the terms of its own first impression cannot be as easily dismissed as a species that walks in silent and waiting to be judged. I sat with that answer for a long moment before responding. I told him it was a strange kind of confidence, built not from strength, but from the memory of having been treated as weak. He agreed with me, and then he said something that surprised me even more than his fluency in my language had. He said that confidence built from memory of weakness tends to be far more durable than confidence built from simple strength, because strength can be lost, but the memory of having survived, being underestimated, never truly fades. He said humans had learned to treat every challenge as an opportunity to prove something, not to us specifically, but to themselves. I found myself against every instinct my upbringing had carved into me, admiring him. We spoke for far longer than protocol would normally allow between a queen and a foreign envoy, moving between formal Kalisa and his own native tongue as the conversation grew less rigid and more genuinely curious. He asked me questions about my empire that most ambassadors never think to ask, not questions about military strength or trade value, but questions about our history, our culture, the reasons behind our customs rather than simply their existence. He asked me why the morning chant framed grief as a gift rather than a burden. I found myself explaining a piece of my own culture's philosophy to an outsider in a way I had never needed to before, because no outsider had ever cared enough to ask the reason behind the ritual rather than simply memorizing its form. There was a moment, small and easy to overlook, where he made an error translating a common human idiom into Kalisa, something about time and money that simply did not translate correctly across our two cultures. He caught the mistake himself, laughed quietly at his own error, and apologized in a tone that held no embarrassment, only warmth. That small moment told me more about humanity than the entire fluent recitation of the morning chant had. He was not performing perfection for me. He was genuinely trying, and when he failed in small ways, he did not hide it or panic over it. He simply corrected himself and continued, treating the mistake as nothing more than a natural part of communication between two different peoples, still learning each other. My own court would never have allowed such an error to be witnessed by a queen. My own advisors rehearsed their words for hours before addressing me, terrified of the consequences a single misstep might bring. Here was a representative of an entirely unfamiliar species, sitting alone with me in a private chamber, comfortable enough in his own uncertainty to laugh at himself in front of the most powerful ruler he had ever met. By the time the meeting ended, hours later than either of us had likely intended, I understood something that would reshape how I approached every conversation that followed. Humanity had not learned my language to gain an advantage over me in negotiation, not primarily. They had learned it because they refused to enter any relationship with any species, believing themselves powerless within it. They had turned centuries of being dismissed by stronger forces on their own world into a discipline, a habit of preparation so thorough it bordered on the impossible. I dismissed Daniel Hart from the private chamber with formal courtesy, the mask of composure sliding back into place as easily as it always did. But once the door closed behind him, I remained seated for a long while, staring at nothing, turning his words over in my mind again and again. Orcanth entered eventually, unable to contain his curiosity any longer, and asked what I had learned from the human that was worth risking hours alone with an unknown envoy. I told him the truth, though I suspect he did not fully understand its weight at the time. I told him that I had expected to meet a species eager to earn our respect through obedience, the way so many others had before them, offering deference in exchange for protection, or trade, or simple survival within our sphere of influence. Instead, I had met a species that had already decided, long before ever meeting us, that they would not accept being treated as lesser, not through defiance, not through aggression, but through sheer, relentless preparation. I told my steward that this changed everything about how we needed to approach the coming negotiations. He asked me what I meant. I told him that for the first time in 30 cycles of rule, I was not entirely certain which side of the table held the greater advantage. He did not sleep well that night either, I later learned. Neither, I suspect, did most of my court, once word of the private audience began to spread through the station's corridors, carried on whispers that grew larger and stranger with every retelling. But I did not regret the meeting, not for a single moment. Whatever came next, whatever challenges or dangers this new alliance might bring, I found myself facing them with something I had not felt in longer than I could remember. Genuine curiosity about what a species could become when it refused, absolutely and permanently, to be underestimated ever again. 3 days after our private conversation, the trouble I had not yet named finally arrived, and it arrived wearing the polished smile of a rival I had known for many cycles. Ambassador Vren of the Sorlin Compact requested an emergency audience before the formal negotiations with humanity could even properly begin. I knew, the moment his request reached me, that this would not be a simple diplomatic courtesy. Vren did nothing without calculation. His empire had watched the Kale Dominion expand for generations with poorly hidden resentment, and any opportunity to weaken my position was an opportunity he would seize without hesitation. He arrived in my grand chamber with an entourage larger than protocol required, a deliberate display meant to remind everyone present of the Sorlin Compact's own considerable influence across this sector. Vren himself moved with the practiced elegance of someone who had spent decades learning exactly how much space to occupy in a room without appearing to try. He began, as expected, with pleasantries so hollow they barely qualified as words at all. Then, without wasting further time, he arrived at the true purpose of his visit. He said he had heard troubling reports. Reports that the newly contacted human species had somehow acquired fluency in Kalisisa, a language reserved exclusively for Kale royalty and their most trusted scholars. He said this raised serious questions about how such sensitive information had been obtained, and whether the security of my empire's most guarded traditions had somehow been compromised. I told him, evenly, that human linguists had reconstructed the language through years of independent study, using nothing more than publicly available fragments and intercepted communications from routine scout patrols. Vren's expression shifted into something that resembled sympathy, though I recognized it immediately as performance rather than genuine feeling. He said that such an explanation, while perhaps technically true, still troubled him deeply. He suggested, carefully, delicately, that a species capable of penetrating our most protected cultural knowledge so quickly might represent a far greater risk than my court currently understood. He wondered aloud, in front of my assembled nobles, whether my judgment in pursuing further relations with humanity had perhaps been influenced by something other than clear strategic thinking. The accusation was subtle, but I understood exactly what he was implying. He was suggesting, without saying it outright, that I had somehow been manipulated, that my private meeting with Daniel Hart had compromised my objectivity, that a queen who had once negotiated fearlessly with warlords had suddenly become soft in the presence of a clever alien envoy. Murmurs spread through my court immediately. I saw doubt flicker across several noble faces, doubt that had clearly been simmering since word of my private audience first spread. Vren had chosen his moment well. He always did. I could have dismissed him outright, relied on the authority of my throne alone to silence the accusation. But authority alone rarely settles doubt once it has been planted. Doubt requires proof to dissolve it, not simply command. I made a decision in that moment that surprised even myself. I summoned the human delegation to the chamber immediately, interrupting their scheduled preparations for the formal negotiations still to come. I wanted this addressed publicly, decisively, before Vren's carefully planted seed could grow into something my court could not easily uproot. Daniel Hart arrived within minutes, calm despite the sudden summons, flanked by two other human representatives I recognized from the original delegation. He must have understood immediately that something significant was unfolding, yet his expression betrayed nothing beyond attentive readiness. I explained, briefly and in Kalisa, so that my own court would understand every word without delay, that Ambassador Vren had raised concerns about the security implications of humanity's fluency in our royal tongue. I explained that these concerns had, whether intentionally or not, extended into questions about my own judgment as ruler. I watched Daniel Hart's face carefully as I spoke. I saw no panic there, no defensive scrambling for words. I saw only the same quiet focus I had witnessed during our private meeting, the look of someone calculating the best path forward rather than searching desperately for any path at all. He asked for permission to address the full court directly. I granted it. What happened next I did not expect, even after everything I had already witnessed from this remarkable and unpredictable species. Daniel Hart stepped forward to the center of the chamber floor, and instead of offering a simple defense or explanation, he began speaking in a form of Kalisa I had not heard used in open court for longer than most of my nobles had been alive. It was the right of open standing, an ancient diplomatic tradition from the earliest centuries of the Kale Dominion, a formal declaration once used by outside envoys to prove their intentions before a ruling monarch, back when our empire was still young and untrusting of the wider galaxy around it. The right had fallen out of common use for generations, preserved now only in historical archives and the deepest teachings of our royal scholars. I had learned it as a child, more as a piece of history than a living tradition. I doubted more than a handful of nobles currently standing in that chamber even recognized what they were hearing. Daniel Hart recited it flawlessly, the ancient structure of vows and declarations flowing from him with a gravity that silenced every whisper in the room. He declared, in the old formal language, that humanity's intentions toward the Kale Dominion were offered in transparency, that any knowledge gained of our culture had been pursued not to exploit weakness, but to ensure no misunderstanding could ever be used as an excuse for conflict between our two peoples. He invoked the old promise embedded within the right, a vow that any envoy speaking these words falsely would forfeit all claim to honorable treatment under Kale law, a vow with real consequences even now, should it ever be proven broken. The chamber fell utterly silent when he finished. I looked toward Vren and saw, for the first time in all our years of political rivalry, genuine surprise crack through his carefully maintained composure. He had not expected this. He had walked into my court, prepared to accuse humanity of theft and manipulation, and instead he had witnessed a member of that same species invoke one of the oldest and most binding traditions of my own empire, a tradition so obscure that even his own advisors, standing just behind him, exchanged confused and uncertain glances. I rose from my throne, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough for its full weight to settle over the room before I spoke. I announced, formally and for the record, that the right of open standing had been properly invoked and properly honored, and that any further accusation, questioning humanity's intentions toward my empire, would now carry the same legal weight as accusing them of breaking a sacred vow before witnesses. I reminded my court, and Ambassador Vren specifically, exactly what the historical consequences for such an accusation, if later proven false or made in bad faith, had traditionally been. Vren understood immediately that he had lost far more ground than he had gained. He offered a stiff, formal apology, careful and hollow in the way all his words tended to be, and requested permission to withdraw from the chamber. I granted it without hesitation, watching him leave with his entourage trailing uncertainly behind him, their earlier confidence noticeably diminished. Once the chamber had cleared of rival observers, once only my own trusted court and the human delegation remained, I turned to Daniel Hart and asked him, quietly, how he had known the right of open standing at all. It was not information easily found even within our own historical archives, buried deep within scholarly texts, rarely accessed outside royal training. He told me that his research team had uncovered references to the right while studying historical treaties between the Kale Dominion and several long-extinct neighboring species, records preserved in trade archives that had passed through many hands over many centuries. He said his team had prepared it as a contingency, a tool to be used only if circumstances required proving humanity's good intentions beyond simple words. He said, plainly, that his people had learned long ago that good intentions alone rarely protect anyone from suspicion. Sometimes intentions needed to be proven through actions that could not easily be dismissed or reinterpreted by those looking for reasons to distrust you. I asked him whether he had expected to need the right so soon, within mere days of humanity's first formal contact with my empire. He answered honestly, as he always seemed to, that he had hoped he would not need it at all, but that hoping for the best while preparing thoroughly for far worse outcomes was simply how his people had learned to survive long before they ever left their own world. I found myself, once again, staring at this quiet, unassuming human envoy with something bordering on disbelief. My own scholars had needed the right of open standing explained to several younger nobles after the chamber cleared, reminding them of traditions many had forgotten even existed within their own culture. Yet this human, representing a species barely known to my empire for more than a handful of cycles, had walked into my court, prepared to defend himself, using knowledge of my own history more thoroughly researched than most of my own people currently possessed. That evening, alone in my private quarters, I found myself questioning something I had never truly questioned before across 30 cycles of rule. I had always believed that the greatest threats to my empire would come from species with greater military strength, greater resources, greater raw power than my own considerable forces. I had spent decades preparing my court and my armies for exactly that kind of danger. I had never once prepared for a species whose greatest strength was simply refusing to be caught unprepared for anything at all. Humanity had not defeated Vren's accusations through strength or wealth or political maneuvering in the way my empire typically settled such disputes. They had defeated it through patience, through years of quiet preparation invested long before any need for it had even arisen, through a willingness to study and understand a culture not their own so thoroughly that they could defend themselves using that very culture's own deepest traditions. I understood, that night, that my empire's relationship with humanity would never resemble any relationship I had built with another species before. This would not be a partnership between a stronger empire and a weaker one seeking protection. This would be something else entirely, something my 30 cycles of experience had not prepared me to properly define. I did not yet know whether that realization should frighten me or fill me with hope. I suspected, deep down, that it would eventually need to be both. The formal negotiations began the following morning, and I entered the chamber with a different understanding of the species sitting across from me than I had carried only days earlier. I had prepared for these talks the way I prepared for every major negotiation in my reign, with detailed briefings from my economic advisors, projections of resource value, careful maps of territorial boundaries, and trade routes that would shape the relationship between our empires for generations to come. Orkanth had spent the previous night compiling updated reports, adjusting his recommendations based on everything that had unfolded during Vren's failed accusation. What I had not prepared for was how thoroughly humanity had already anticipated every angle of the conversation before it began. Daniel Hart led the human delegation once again, joined this time by a woman named Elena Brooks, introduced to me as the lead linguist responsible for much of the original research into Kalissa. She carried herself with a quieter confidence than Daniel, more reserved, but her eyes moved across the chamber with the same careful attentiveness I had noticed in him during our very first meeting. The negotiations themselves stretched across many hours, covering trade agreements, technology sharing limitations, territorial boundaries along the neutral systems separating our two civilizations, and the delicate matter of establishing diplomatic presence within each other's core territories. At every turn, humanity's delegation demonstrated a depth of preparation that unsettled my own advisors more than once. When my trade minister proposed terms designed to favor Kale interests in resource extraction along the border systems, Daniel Hart countered not with simple refusal, but with a detailed alternative proposal that had clearly been prepared long before the meeting, referencing precedents from agreements my empire had made with other species decades earlier, agreements humanity should not have had easy access to, yet somehow had studied thoroughly. When Orkanth attempted to introduce a clause granting the Kale Dominion priority access to any newly discovered resources within contested territory, Elena Brooks responded with a counter clause phrased so precisely within the formal legal structure of Kale treaty language that even my own legal scholars needed several minutes of quiet consultation before finding appropriate grounds to respond. I watched my own court grow increasingly uncomfortable as the day progressed, not because humanity behaved with hostility or aggression, but because they simply refused to be caught without an answer, refused to concede ground through simple lack of preparation, the way so many other species had during their own first negotiations with my empire. During a brief recess, Orkanth pulled me aside, his expression tight with something between frustration and reluctant admiration. He said that in all his years serving my court, he had never negotiated against a delegation so thoroughly prepared for every possible direction a conversation might take. He said it felt less like negotiating with a newly contacted species, and more like negotiating with an empire that had studied us for centuries rather than mere years. I told him that this was precisely the point Daniel Hart had tried to explain to me during our private meeting days earlier. Humanity did not intend to enter any relationship believing themselves at a disadvantage. They had turned the very real fear of being dismissed and underestimated into a discipline so thorough it had reshaped how their entire species approached every unfamiliar situation. When the negotiations resumed, I made a decision that surprised my own advisors nearly as much as it likely surprised the human delegation. Rather than continuing to treat the conversation as a contest to be won through careful maneuvering and calculated advantage, I chose instead to speak with Daniel Hart directly and honestly about what I believed a lasting relationship between our two civilizations should actually look like. I told him that I did not wish to build an alliance based on which side could out-prepare the other in every single meeting. I told him that I had ruled long enough to understand that alliances built purely on calculated advantage tend to collapse the moment either side believes they have gained sufficient leverage to abandon fairness. I proposed something different. I proposed that rather than treating every clause and every boundary as a battlefield to be won, we instead approach the remaining negotiations with the same spirit humanity had already shown in learning my language and honoring my empire's ancient traditions, a spirit of genuine mutual respect rather than careful calculation. Daniel Hart was quiet for a long moment after I finished speaking. Then he said something that I have carried with me ever since, something that shaped not only the remainder of those negotiations, but the entire foundation of the alliance that would eventually form between our two civilizations. He said that humanity's careful preparation had never been meant as a weapon against potential allies. It had always been meant as protection against being taken advantage of by those who assumed they could dismiss human interests without consequence. He said that if I was offering genuine partnership rather than the kind of conditional tolerance humanity had learned to expect from more powerful civilizations, then his people would meet that offer with the same honesty and respect I was extending. From that point forward, the negotiations shifted in tone entirely. Clauses that had been debated fiercely only hours earlier were resolved through open conversation rather than careful legal maneuvering. Both delegations began speaking plainly about their genuine concerns rather than hiding true priorities behind strategic phrasing. By the time the sun cycle of that neutral station reached its final hours, we had drafted the framework for what would become the first formal alliance between the Kale Dominion and the human race, built not on the assumption that one civilization held power over the other, but on mutual acknowledgement that both civilizations had earned the right to stand as equals at the negotiating table. As the chamber slowly emptied that evening, Daniel Hart approached me once more, alone, without the formal weight of full delegations surrounding either of us. He said that he wanted to share something with me privately, something that had not been part of any official briefing or prepared statement. He told me that when humanity first detected clear evidence of the Kale Dominion's existence, years before any formal contact had been established, there had been significant fear among his people. Fear of an empire so much larger and more advanced than their own fledgling civilization. Fear that first contact, whenever it eventually came, would result in humanity being treated the way stronger civilizations throughout human history had so often treated those they considered lesser. He said that fear had driven much of the preparation I had witnessed over the past several days, not simple ambition or desire to impress, but genuine determination to ensure that whatever judgment my empire eventually passed upon humanity, it would be a fair judgment, made with full understanding rather than convenient assumption. He said that meeting me, a queen willing to set aside calculated advantage in favor of genuine partnership, had done more to ease that original fear than any amount of preparation ever could have. I told him honestly that I had entered our first meeting expecting to encounter a species desperate for protection, eager to accept whatever terms my empire offered in exchange for safety within a dangerous galaxy. I told him that instead, I had encountered a species who had taught me something I had genuinely believed myself too experienced and too old to still learn after 30 cycles of rule. I had learned that true strength is not always measured in military power or territorial size. Sometimes it is measured in the quiet, relentless refusal to ever again be caught unprepared, in the willingness to spend years studying and understanding another culture not to exploit it, but to ensure no misunderstanding could ever be twisted into an excuse for conflict. Humanity had walked into my court, expecting to need a translator to survive the conversation. Instead, they had reshaped how an empire far older and far larger than their own would forever think about strength, preparation, and respect. Many cycles have passed since that first meeting, and I find myself, even now, returning often to the memory of that opening moment, the sound of my own sacred language, spoken correctly by a voice that should never have been able to speak it at all. The alliance between the Kale Dominion and humanity was formally signed within a single season of that first negotiation, a speed that stunned observers across many neighboring civilizations who had expected such talks to stretch across years, if they succeeded at all. News of the agreement spread quickly through the wider galactic community, carried along trade routes and diplomatic channels by ambassadors eager to understand exactly what had happened during those few remarkable days aboard a neutral station most of them had never even heard of before. Ambassador Vren never fully recovered his standing within my court after his failed accusation. Word travels quickly among ruling houses, and few things damage a reputation more thoroughly than publicly misjudging a rising power. The Sorlin Compact eventually sought its own formal contact with humanity, cautious and considerably more respectful than their first attempt at influence had been. I have heard, through channels that reach even a queen's private chambers, that their negotiations proceeded far more carefully than Vren's earlier arrogance would ever have allowed. Daniel Hart returned to human space not long after the alliance was formalized, though he did not disappear from my life the way most departing envoys eventually do. He became, over the following seasons, the primary liaison between our two civilizations, a role he approached with the same quiet, thorough dedication I had witnessed from our very first meeting. I found myself, more often than protocol strictly required, requesting his presence for matters that could easily have been handled through lesser officials. Some of my advisors whispered that a queen should not grow so familiar with a foreign envoy, regardless of how valuable his service had proven. I paid those whispers little attention. 30 cycles of rule have taught me that true value, once recognized, should never be dismissed simply to satisfy the comfort of tradition. Human researchers continued their study of Kalisa long after the alliance was signed, and within a few short seasons, fluency in our royal tongue had spread beyond the small original team who first mastered it. This might have troubled me once, back when I still believed our language's exclusivity was the true source of its sacred weight. I understand now that a language's true value was never found in how few could speak it, but in how deeply those who learned it chose to honor what it represented. Elena Brooks eventually established a formal academy on a human world dedicated entirely to studying Kale history, culture, and language, an institution unlike anything any species outside my own empire had ever built in honor of us. She invited Kale scholars to teach alongside human researchers, an exchange of knowledge flowing genuinely in both directions rather than the one-sided tribute so many other alliances throughout my empire's long history had demanded. My own court changed as well, in ways I had not expected when this journey first began. Younger nobles, inspired by witnessing humanity's relentless preparation and genuine curiosity, began pursuing deeper study of our own history and traditions, rediscovering pieces of Kale culture that had grown dusty and forgotten across generations of assumed superiority. It seems strange, even now, that it required an outside species proving their respect for our traditions before my own people rediscovered a similar respect for themselves. I asked Daniel Hart once, many seasons after our first meeting, whether he had ever imagined, back during those long years of quiet preparation before formal contact was even established, that things would unfold the way they eventually did. He told me honestly that he had not. He said his team had prepared for many possible outcomes, ranging from outright rejection to cautious tolerance, but genuine partnership built on mutual respect had never seemed like the most likely result, given how first contact scenarios had so often unfolded throughout recorded history between civilizations of vastly different scale and power. I asked him what had changed his expectations. He said that meeting a queen willing to notice the difference between calculated performance and genuine effort, willing to set aside the comfortable assumption of superiority long enough to actually listen, had changed everything about how the rest of the relationship unfolded. I told him in turn that meeting a species willing to spend years of quiet, unrewarded effort simply to ensure they would never again be caught unprepared or dismissed without a fair hearing had changed something in me as well, something I had not expected any outside species to be capable of changing, after 30 cycles of rule had settled so many of my assumptions into permanent shape. There is a term in Kalissa that has no direct translation into human language, a word reserved for describing someone who becomes family not through blood, but through effort freely given and respect genuinely earned over time. It is a rare word, used sparingly, reserved for bonds that form slowly and prove themselves through action rather than declaration. I taught that word to Daniel Hart during one of our later conversations, explaining its meaning as carefully as I could, watching him turn the sounds over in his mouth with the same careful determination he had shown during our very first meeting, refusing to let imperfection stop him from trying. He asked me, once he had practiced the pronunciation until it finally settled correctly on his tongue, what it truly meant to be given such a word by a ruling queen of my empire. I told him it meant that whatever came next for our two civilizations, whatever challenges or conflicts or triumphs the future still held in store for both our peoples, humanity would never again need to prove itself worthy of respect within my court. That respect, hard-earned through years of quiet preparation and genuine effort, had already been given, and it would not be so easily taken away. I think back often to that first meeting, to the moment I expected to require a translator, and instead heard my own sacred language spoken back to me by a voice that had no natural right to know it at all. I think of how certain I had been, in that instant, that something had gone deeply wrong. I understand now that nothing had gone wrong at all. Something extraordinary had simply begun, quietly and without fanfare, the way most truly important things in this galaxy tend to begin. I no longer wonder what humanity might eventually become as their reach continues to expand outward among the stars. I no longer feel only fear at the thought of what a species capable of such relentless preparation and quiet determination might one day achieve. I feel something closer to certainty now, the kind of certainty that comes only from having witnessed genuine character, proven not through strength or wealth or territory, but through the simple, unwavering refusal to ever again be underestimated by anyone, including a queen who once believed she had already seen everything the galaxy had left to show her. I was wrong about that, as it turns out. I find, even now, that I do not mind having been wrong at all.